Welcome to the GovAI Podcast, where innovation meets governance, and each episode we go beyond the buzzwords to explore how AI is reshaping public service. From real-world success stories to the tough lessons of adoption, we uncover the future of government, one decision at a time. AI is one of the most powerful technologies of our time, and government is still figuring out how to navigate this new frontier. Join me as we explore how AI is transforming public service, unlocking potential efficiencies, and the risks that no one's really talking about, and what happens when innovation moves faster than regulation. And starting today, I'm excited to have a real thought partner on the mic as my co-host, Dustin Haisler. Welcome, Dustin.
Great to be here.
Honestly, I can't think of a better person to have as a co-host on the show, trying to help me make a sense of where all this is heading, AI, and especially in government. As some of you or many of you know, Dustin recently joined us at Darwin as our Chief AI Officer and U.S. General Manager. And if you've spent time in government or in the GovTech space, you've probably crossed paths with Dustin, keynoting at a conference or at events across the country, which he's done hundreds of. But really, I think what makes him such a good partner for this conversation is that he's been really close in the inner circle of some of the decisions, watching how the technology lands inside the public sector and in these institutions, when it's working, where it helps, where it's failing and struggling. And so also, of course, as someone who was formerly the president of the Republic and leading GovTech and governing publications, seeing where the story gets a little more complicated than maybe what the headline suggests. So great to have you as co-host and kicking off the GovAI podcast.
I'm excited. Now we get to nerd out on AI every day, all year long. So today, I thought it would be good to take a step back and to catch up on what's been happening. I mean, this is like an exponential landscape. Everything's changing. At least we've kind of standardized on naming conventions, but now there's, a battle on the top spot for frontier models. We've got ChatGPT and Gemini, 3 that's just come to the forefront. There's the race to build and control compute. There's all of the dynamics that are happening at the federal level as it relates to kind of the new EO that dropped, and I know we'll talk about that, and just, guidance on AI in government, right? As we've talked to CIOs across the country and chief AI officers and mission owners and mayors and city managers, there's a lot of things that are happening in the trenches of the United States with AI. And so we're excited to kind of dig into all of that. And I thought maybe first, let's take the EO, because that's kind of the elephant in the room. That swooped in, created a lot of confusion, threw out the word preemption a few times, and where do we land?
All right, so let's unpack that together. I think you can probably jump in the weeds, but I'll give the high level, right? Everyone has been expecting it. There's been rumors. There was a few attempts at the executive order to be written and coming out. There was even an attempt at a vote in Congress that was, shut down. And then we really didn't expect or weren't sure whether it wouldn't come out, mainly because there wasn't overwhelming support by any of the parties. But I think David Sachs, the AI czar, really had to put his neck on the line here to get something out to show for, and pushing out the executive order with a lot of pressure to get something out. The language is highly vague, and in most analyses, if you're listening to the news, you would hear between the lines is highly political or aimed not necessarily at tackling other states that are looking at governing themselves or internal governance on AI, but rather more at limiting model developers around how they manage their outputs and their LLMs themselves and the autonomy that they're able to do so. And so if we're saying this in other words, if we're going to be direct here on the podcast, which we always should try and be, really we're talking about California, Colorado, some of those states that have put laws that specifically are calling out looking into the outputs of LLM models, rather than states like Texas and Traeger, which we'll jump into, which are a little more focused on the AI procurement laws, which California has as well. So this sets up this clash of titans. And then we'll also, I'm curious, Dustin, get your thoughts. Just the other day, we saw New York come out with some AI regulation and laws that matches a bit of California language. So it's almost like we have clashing tidal waves coming up against us.
Yeah.
Tell me how you're seeing this.
Yeah, the timing was interesting. I mean, it wasn't unexpected, I think, as you said, but the way I described it to a group of state CIOs is this is kind of like the feds issuing a press release ahead of session saying, hey, it's okay to regulate AI governance, internal use of AI, even some of the procurement dynamics associated with it were exempted by the executive order. But don't regulate the private sector utilization. Don't require, bias testing or ongoing, kind of disclosure of underlying, training sets of data. That's kind of what the focus was. And I think, what was interesting is they use the word preemption a lot. There's some legality kind of questions in terms of whether the feds can legally withhold funding. Just from a mechanics standpoint, though, I mean, for those of you listening in and you see the media rhetoric around, Trump targets, kind of state AI laws, this does not make those AI laws go away. So if you think Trega and Colorado and California and all the laws that are in place, those are still in effect, and their effective dates, if they haven't taken effect yet, are still actually accurate. I think what's been interesting, though, is the feds basically put these states on notice saying if you do have provisions there, they're going to target you, and they're going to target you in a couple different ways. One, there's the DOJ that may try to sue you. There's the BEAD funding, the non-deployment funding that they may try to hold back. There's a few tactics that are here, whether they have the legal ability to do that. I think what's important to know, and like the net is that the feds can't actually undo state law without congressional approval. And so this is an executive order similar to the IIJA clawback attempts that we saw in the past. So I think it's important to look at it more like a press release, and more information is to come. I think as we saw, there's a lot of dates that are 90 days out within this, where there's, an attempt to build a national standard on this, and a lot of things that, are not bad ideas. But I think, to your point on even what New York did recently, this is showing you that we're about to play a game of chess, and states are not going to stop with AI regulation. I think New York is just warming up, and I think other states, it's going to be a wild 2026 as we look at states in session.
Okay, we're supposed to get to 2026 later, but I have to jump in and give me some of your bets here on where you think this is heading.
I think you're going to see more patchwork regulation as it relates to AI at the state level. And I think you're going to start to see data privacy and AI laws intersect, right? We've got a lot of existing laws in the books that start to play bumper cars with some of the AI regs that are flowing. And I think that has to be reconciled. And it's not going to be reconciled anytime soon through federal action, trying to create like a US version of what's happening in Europe. But I think it's going to be a year of more patchwork state law as it relates to this, but a little bit of a tug of war between what is actually able to be regulated here. I think the feds will challenge states, but states will fire back, as we've seen with New York, but it's going to go to the courts. And I think basically we're in this period of time where you're going to have regulatory stalemate in terms of the private sector utilization of AI as we start to think about disclosure and some of these things. And I think that's a little bit by design. I think the important thing here, though, is there's still rampant usage internally inside of government. So many use cases, so much innovation that's happening there. And this does not mean that you don't pay attention to that stuff. This means that you focus on that and you still work on the foundational stuff that you need to be doing as a part of it. Because we're going to see, I would argue this year you're going to have open records requests where people are going to scan the ordinances and laws you're writing to look at what percentage was written by AI. And you're going to start to see challenges to produce those records. You're going to see more states like Washington did this past year come out with additional guidance in terms of what AI is as a record and the prompts that have to be kept as a part of that. You're going to see new threats that emerge. So there's an exponential landscape of change that I think is about to, hit agencies. So now is really the time to start to focus on how do you tame the chaos.
And the records management is one piece. I think you briefly mentioned the cyber piece. Let's look back for a second. When did agencies start to get their act together around cybersecurity? When ransomware started hitting across the board. So it was really more reactive, which is classic oftentimes within government. And when we think about AI now and think about it in the realm of cybersecurity, it can be a game changer, because right now the attack vectors are usually human designed and have to be highly adjusted and dynamic to the organization that they're attacking. But when you start to use LLMs that can dynamically identify the environment they're in and even the vulnerabilities within the environment as they're entering, whether it's malware or something else, that all of a sudden opens up a lot of different attack vectors. Not only that, because it can be an AI bot, you can automate that bot and create thousands of them rather than a single human. It really opens up a whole new risk vector that I don't think most public agencies yet are understanding. But as I think often happens, the minute one or two of these AI ransomware attacks starts to happen, I think a lot of people will be waking up to the new reality of what cybersecurity looks like in the age of AI.
I think it's a great point. We're kind of at the App Store moment of AI. And I know ChatGPT recently brought in their App Store equivalent, but we're about to see an explosion of AI with a bunch of niche best of breed solutions. It's invading the existing apps you have. And it's kind of like this cloud era all over again. Even though it's new infrastructure, new technology, we're also creating lots of different data stores, lots of different model utilization. It's going to create an orchestration nightmare as you start to think about how do I actually secure this playing field of LLMs that I don't even know what frontier model these organizations are using. Now the feds are challenging my ability to actually ask them for that level of data. And so we're going to see kind of a little bit of chaos here as it relates to that, especially from a procurement standpoint. And I think in addition to like AI as a standalone thing, what's important to know is there's an arms race happening within the existing GovTech applications to bring AI in. And so how do we deal with change management dynamics? How do we deal with the security threats from within the model? What is the agency's ability to control that? So there's all these new kind of dynamics that I think we're going to have to start to confront and confront it very quickly.
It's a good transition. Let's break it down a little bit for our audience and listeners on what's happening across the AI foundational model landscape. I think everyone's following the news, so they're aware that Gemini has been doing something exciting. OpenAI has been in code red for the last few weeks. But I think underneath that surface, we need to unpack a little bit, because when you think about it, there's some serious decisions here. If you are a public entity that is now thinking about what is your platform of choice that you want to buy licenses for at an enterprise level, how do you look at that from a selection of what model will be best served for your organization? Maybe it's a multi-model approach. A lot of agencies we see are going with Copilot because of the Office suite and Microsoft, but there are some that are starting to look at OpenAI. And then Gemini came along. And I think what's been different about them is focusing on the whole soup to nuts from the TPUs, which are their own tensor processing unit. So rather than relying on NVIDIA's GPU, which is costly and the bottleneck in the industry, they've developed their own tensor processing unit that allows their own models to run on it in a more effective way. There's some questions on how they're running the memory and context window, but aside from that, the performance actually was quite phenomenal and outdid latest models of OpenAI, which then led to a burst of releases from OpenAI in the last few weeks with new models and new image generators. There was Nano Banana from Gemini. So walk us for a second through this arms race that we've seen the last, like month or two, really, between Gemini, Google, and then I think because of all of our listeners, our public sector, where does Copilot sit in all of this? Because a lot are buying the Copilot licenses.
Yeah, I think you did a great kind of example of what was going on between Gemini and Copilot. And that's going to happen at a much larger scale. I mean, if you look at the amount of money that's being poured into, some of these frontier models and the innovation that's happening, and even just looking at architecture changes and all the advancement that's going into it. I mean, this is an exponential technology that's also a general purpose technology that's evolving very rapidly. Adoption is off the charts, but it's also moving, evolving, and changing very frequently. So if your AI strategy is a single app, that's a flawed approach, because that single application may change. It's like putting all your eggs in one basket and expecting that respective technology to be the front runner. We don't know. It's kind of like everything that happened with the internet. If you look at like the .com boom and bust, it's all happening right now over the span of the next 18 months. And so you're going to see a lot of companies fail. You're going to see some consolidation activity. And so now is not the time to just bet on one application like Copilot. You have to be platform agnostic. And if your strategy is also like even the multimodal things where it's like, I'm going to have one place where they can come and they can pick their model and use it, and we'll put safeguards there. I would even argue that in itself is not enough, because, what do people do when they need to evaluate an email or something else? They're going to go outside of the traditional enterprise channel, go to freechatgpt.com, and they're going to do it there. So I think we're in this interesting period where there's a lot of chaos. It's all of these exponential bands that are collapsing at once. You're going to see a lot of market consolidation and activity, but you need to be flexible. So if you think about if you're building infrastructure and you're building kind of the foundation here, interoperability is key. Focusing on requiring vendors to do the same. You want flexibility here. You want to make sure that you can flip models and switch models as needed as things progress. If you're buying it, same thing is true here, right? You want to make sure that you're thinking broadly about this and that you're not just focused on one thing. And you also have to really make sure that your AI strategy thinks beyond like that single application, right? Copilot has great use cases around meeting transcription and summarization. I will give them that. But as you look at some of these other domains, there may be other models that are better, right? Claude is great at humanizing text. Gemini is becoming a really good general purpose day-to-day tool because of the context that it can kind of have. But there's just so much chaos right now happening. So I think you have to be adaptable and you have to be flexible and you have to make sure that the way you're approaching this is really agnostic to the underlying technology and the models that they're using.
Yeah, and I'll add, I mean, I look at this, as you know, I always look at the underbelly beneath all of it, which I think we're, not paying enough attention to it as an industry because there's an arms race, as you mentioned, to compute power processing. And I was just writing a blog about this the other day. OpenAI, with its latest deal with Samsung and some of the other chip providers, is buying 40% of the worldwide silicon. That's insane. So 40% of the worldwide silicon they're buying, and they don't even want them like designed as the silicon chips. They want just the wafers. They want the raw materials so they can go and develop in their own design system for their processing. And just to explain the reason this is important, this is the ability for them to kind of run the short-term memory that's required for a lot of the AI processing. And as we're building out more and more, I mean, this is consuming power processing requirements. And so it'll be interesting to see the players that have a leg up here are the ones that will secure the supply chain. NVIDIA did this brilliantly, right, with what they did on the GPU side. And so I'm interested to follow some of the big bets that OpenAI is doing. Maybe they're swinging too big. But one thing I think underlying to your point on a multi-model approach is that in the last year or two, we thought the only game in town really from anyone that knew performance was OpenAI. That was the model for consumers. And all of a sudden, Gemini, I think, came and broke that hegemony. And now all of a sudden, the playing field has been equaled. Now it's starting to look at, to your point, is what's the right model for my tool and how do I build a multi-purpose approach? I'm interested to see where that ends up in end of 2026, where that goes from here.
I think it's going to be fascinating. And I think on top of this too, we're talking about the internal utilization of AI, but what's also rapidly evolving is a constituent utilization of AI. AI is becoming far more personal. So you're going to have existing government transactional systems and even your website that become abstracted by these models. And so there's a whole question on, do I optimize for it? Do I suppress it? Do I block it? Right? Look at how you find information out about what you're going to do, whether my son, when he went to get his driver's license, never actually went to the state's website to try to figure out what paperwork he needed. He just went to ChatGPT and asked, and then it gave it to him. Never validated the information, but fortunate for him, it was correct in that regard. So I think the fundamental experience of government is going to go through an evolution. And the key point here is it's whether agencies authorize it or not. People are going to use bots to fill out forms. People are going to use technology to make calls. So we have to start to prepare the underlying public sector infrastructure, not only for our employees' utilization of this, but for the transactional systems that are about to be overwhelmed by the open records requests that are driven by consumer bots, by all of the agentic stuff that's coming.
So let's call the child by its name, though. One of the underlying bottlenecks in this in government is going to be procurement. So if you're procuring a new solution in AI, and let's just take for the sake you did it last year, and you put out an RFP, and now your RFP award comes out, I don't know, since you wrote it to the specs, to then this year, let's say 2026 comes out next quarter, everything's changed. So how do government agencies think about procuring these solutions in a way that they pick the right vendors, the vendors selected actually, may have changed their models? How do we adapt for that?
I think it goes back to even some of what we saw originally with cloud. You have to focus on the platform approach. You have to think about orchestration of AI, and you have to think about everything that we dealt with cloud, right? Like when cloud first came into the picture, everybody struggled with, well, what cloud environment do I buy? Am I going to be, a Google shop, an AWS shop? Like, what am I going to be? And then the reality was you're going to be a little bit of all of the above. And I think the same parallel applies to AI. We're going to have that. We need to think a little bit about being agnostic to the underlying models that we're choosing and the infrastructure that's there. And so you need to procure in that way as well, but you need to make sure the vendors you're working with, regardless of the federal EO and some of the other things, are being upfront with their use of AI within the applications. There are laws like Texas has TREGA, the Texas Responsible AI Governance Act, which requires disclosure about AI utilization at the point of constituent interaction. And so you need to start to think about, well, how do I do that? I don't even know where AI might be used. So it's going to require you to work on the procurement side with your industry partners to be upfront with that. And again, this isn't a gotcha thing. This is more so we have to find ways to partner with our industry providers in order to ensure that we're on the same page when AI is introduced into processes, that we're taking policy that we have and we're building human in the loop safeguards on it, that we're agnostic with the underlying infrastructure, that we have our IT governance buttoned up, right? Most agencies have robust IT governance that's just documented and they have all these things. But the problem is the technology is moving quicker than those meetings. And so we have to think about how do we become more adaptable? How do we focus on maybe meeting quarterly, thinking about what are acceptable risks that we want to take, even thinking about things like shadow AI, which we see the vast
Yeah.
majority, 62% of organizations have some form of shadow AI they don't know about.
Most people are just using, right? They're just using the tools. They're not asking for permission.
Right. Well, why not build safeguards around that and actually call it for what it is versus having this naive approach that it doesn't exist and it's out of sight, it's out of mind, it's there, right? Like, so we need to start to think about when it's identified, what do we do? What's the testing parameter?
That's actually, I think, such a big opportunity for government because, I mean, look, since the internet, I haven't seen an adoption curve like this in terms of AI in government from the bottom up. 62% shadow AI essentially means in layman's terms that people are just using it and not asking for permission. Now, that opens up a ton of risk that needs to be governed. And I think you have to manage shadow AI. But it also is a rare opportunity for the leaders and procurement to say, okay, before we go and build out this whole procurement that maybe we have an advisor externally write for us, the RFP, what are people actually wanting to do with these tools? What's the use cases they're looking to do? And then leverage the actual data to say, okay, we're seeing their billing proposal reports with these tools. Maybe we can find the best tool in class that uses AI for this because we're seeing demand. So I think it's a rare opportunity for building out solution procurement bottom up, which raises a question that I want to get your thoughts on around agentic AI. Because if we talked until now mostly around prompt-based LLMs where we interact back and forth with the prompt, different application layers that are built with an API back to one of those same models we just talked about. When you start talking about agentic AI, all of a sudden we're talking about stitching together either fully autonomous processes or autonomous with human in the loop at the end. And that starts to change everything in terms of how government operates, not just the mechanism or channel of communication, but how government works. So how do you think that's going to play out in government? Where are we going to see success in that? Where are there going to be some breaking points there?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think just when we got the definitions down for generative AI, then agentic entered the building and started to confuse everybody. I mean, I think even in 2026, when you look at state legislation, you're going to start to see agentic thrown around. And I think we just need to start to normalize and standardize. So those of you that are listening in, if you're meeting with your legislature, get the definitions right because they mean very different things, right? Generative is naturally human in the loop because someone is driving an output through a prompt. Agentic blurs the line of the human. And so oftentimes when we start talking about agentic AI, people go, well, I would never trust a bot to do all of those things for me. But look at things like records archiving and other functions where robotic process automation and other types of automation have already come in and they've automated those functions, right? And so kind of the early days of some of the agentic things that we're starting to see now. So it's not without precedent that we're going to see more and more agentic AI enter work streams. There's going to be some fundamental guardrails associated with where it can be used, right? So internally to government, you're not going to see like an agentic workflow that someone is outsourcing decision making on like benefits to an agent that's leveraging a bunch of parameters. Like we've been there with banking, we've seen safeguards in place here now as it relates to some of the state legislation that we've seen here. So that's not here, but I think you're going to see some real use cases though with what would you outsource to AI? I mean, if AI is doing research on grant applications and it's looking for grant opportunities to offset funding for planned projects that you have coming up, would you have an agent go do that for you 24 hours a day and bring that research? You're the human in the loop evaluating it. Maybe you ask it to take a first crack at the application, but you're driving the process and leveraging the benefits of having something that's able to kind of take that preference and go do research. So I think you're going to see lots of applications and potential use cases of that where people are going to do that. I think what's going to force agencies to start to really focus on the infrastructure, because agentic is going to require a different interface layer, right? We think about like I go to the web, I enter a website URL, I pull up something, I'm there, right? There's a protocol. And I think as we look at agentic AI, there's some protocols floating around like A2A from Google and MCP to a certain extent, which could be used by these agents. But we're going to need to start to think about when a citizen says, I hit a pothole, I want you, agent, to go bother city council until it's fixed, right? What's the government response to that, right? You're going to be you're going to be on the receiving end of that. And so they're going to leverage all those old historical channels to deal with it. So I think it's going to actually force agencies to think about how they interface back. Because is the future of government a call center overwhelmed by constituent bots? Or is it a call center that's staffed by people that are leveraging agents to pre-field and maybe pre-screen things, and they're able to prioritize based on the output there. So I think we're entering a really interesting transition period here.
Well, I think to that point, like let's take autonomous vehicles, a good example here, because really I would say right now we're starting to cross the Rubicon. We already see a lot of robo taxis and whatnot, but it was about getting to the point where it was clear that the autonomous vehicle was superior in terms of accidents or how many miles it's driven for an accident than a human. And the data is starting to really prove that out, right? In terms of crashes, fatalities, but also just property damage and the like. There are still glitches. Now, the reason I bring that up as an example, because I think agentic AI is going to be a process. Initially, you're going to have the human in the loop built into the process on almost everything. But as it starts to become mainstream, processes that are just basic rudimentary, there is very little reason, if it does it well and in better consistency with less errors, for that not to be some sort of automated process that starts to take place, whether it's in HR or procurement or legal. Now that adds a lot of risk, and that adds a lot of consideration that I think governments should start thinking about, because that changes the dynamic. It's worth mentioning for audience, change the dynamic of how you think of your workforce. You go from an agency that may have had 3,000 employees, all of a sudden every employee may have 10 different agentic autonomous bots or processes. Now you're talking 30,000. So whole different world we're entering to, which I think is a good segue a little bit into how we're looking at 2026. You have the crystal ball, Dustin. Everyone comes to you for their predictions. So give me your 2026 predictions in terms of AI and government for the year ahead.
I think you're going to see the dawn of consumer personal AI agentic interfaces to government. You're going to see more open records requests and more things that are driven by a person, by a citizen, that actually starts to focus on some of this infrastructure dynamic. You're going to see many, many more shiny objects that emerge within the government software apparatus that are leveraging a frontier model or other type of thing that you can use to have a best of breed kind of AI solution. So you're going to have a lot more fragmentation here. And I think just like cloud and like the App Store moment when the iPhone was released a year later, see an explosion of new capabilities and new possibilities with this. And I think that's going to create opportunity, but also the need to organize and orchestrate and kind of manage all of that chaos, because we don't want a bunch of fragmented little bitty, kind of AI models. I do think you're going to see more AI intersecting mission critical domains. It's been interesting to see, even through the end of 2025, more AI in justice and public safety and 911 call centers and some of these more mission critical things. And if you look back to even cloud as a parallel, like the last place an emerging technology goes is a mission critical vertical, right? Because there's so many requirements that are there, and it's, something that you want to make sure that you have fully buttoned up. And we're seeing, a lot of actually innovative use cases of AI starting to work their way into that. So you're going to see a lot more adoption here. As well. I think the frontier model game is going to continue to be a challenge. I think we're going to see front runners that become laggards and vice versa. And so we're going to see a lot of that. I would anticipate we get some hardware glimpses from OpenAI and others that start to look at ways to incorporate AI outside of just the, kind of text or typing type interaction. And even outside of what we've seen with even like the sunglasses and things like that. I mean, AI is going to become more personal. And I think a lot of these frontier models and the companies behind them are working to basically build a very personal version of that in hardware form. So I think we'll get some early indications of what that might look like as well. And then ultimately, I mean, I think agencies are going to continue to find ways to leverage AI to drive all kinds of new use cases. So what's exciting is I think we're seeing things that are not just like the chatbot anymore, but now all kinds of new evolutions of that. And it's been fascinating talking with states that are like building MCP servers and cities that are focusing on all kinds of different things. So it's an exciting time, I think, to be in the market, but we're going to see a lot of change. We're going to see a lot of disruption. And I think, lastly, just from a cyber standpoint, I mean, I think we're going to see a lot more of what we've seen before, just multiplied by AI. Threat vectors lit up in new ways, but also new threats that emerge when we start to think about malicious citations and sources within these LLMs and prompt injection and all these new threat vectors, which are kind of at their infancy today. We're going to see in a much more concerted way start to impact state and local government. So, and then more battle between the feds and the localities, state and local government in terms of who has the authority to regulate and what can they actually regulate as an aspect of AI. But what do you see?
I often say 2025 was the year of the bill. So for governments, if you ask them what the main focus was, it was policy and the bills that were passed around AI, figuring out what they should be, each state taking kind of a different approach to it, and really just a lot of question marks. And so on the adoption side, you really didn't see a lot of scale around AI at the marketplace within the public sector. I think 2026 is where it moves away from, what was the year of the build 2025 to year of building. And what I see there is some of the applications that there was uncertainty on whether they're scalable, how to govern them. It's also the year where some of these AI laws that were passed start to be governed.
Yeah.
Attorney generals start to enforce them. We're starting to see fines coming out, and that will kind of turn on the burners for a lot of these agencies to get governance in place. So I think as we get some of those infrastructure in place, we'll start seeing real examples of AI. And that's critical because once we exit out of pilot land into scale mode, the 10x factor will be in display for those agencies that successfully move there. And very quickly, the rest of their neighbors around, are going to want the same thing. So whether you're talking, I agree with you 100%, it's going to be the most boring, unsexy, back office type of stuff that I think is going to work best first. And so that's where I think if agencies focus in on it, those will be the rising stars that the spotlight will be on, and we'll see a lot of copying around the country around that as well.
What I hope to see more than anything is the evolution from the year of the pilot to a year of enterprise rollout, right? Like I think so many agencies are also testing lots of different things, right? And they're trying to figure out what their strategy is. And I think we just have to start pulling the trigger on some of this and finding ways to really get those kind of back office gains as a part of this. But it starts with having the right foundation and then building on top of that. I think it's going to be a wild year. It's going to be exciting. Things are going to change. And I'm excited for these conversations because we're going to be here to break it down and to kind of give you the perspectives play by play as we start to see what's happening in the industry. And there's going to be a lot of exciting things.
Absolutely. The new duo, Dustin and Noam. So that's it for today, guys. And pleasure having my co-host Dustin out. Moving forward, you're going to see both of us co-hosting with some really exciting guests moving forward. So stay tuned to listen to thought leaders, both from a public sector, entrepreneurs, investors across the space that are kind of really at the frontier. So looking forward to more of these conversations. Stay tuned. You can find us on all the various podcast platforms that you like to listen to. And thanks, Dustin. We're gonna see you guys in the next week or two for our next episode.
Sounds good.